Good morning and welcome to today's Pacific Council program, Together for Tomorrow, Global Partnerships for Climate Solutions. I'm Allison Agsten, Director of the USC Annenberg Center for Climate Journalism and Communication. It has always been clear that an issue of the magnitude of climate change cannot be solved alone, certainly not by one person and not by one country. At a moment when international collaboration is needed more than ever, global relations are strained, and that's on a good day. Our futures depend on cooperation, not just in the decades to come, or for our children and grandchildren, but for us today in this virtual room. Over the past decade alone, extreme weather linked to climate change has cost the global economy more than $2 trillion. The World Health Organization estimates that climate change will cause an additional 250,000 deaths between the years 2030 and 2050. Those numbers are staggering, to be sure, but solutions are abundant in energy, transportation, agricultural, and technology sectors, amongst others, if there is political will. Today, we'll speak with two experts, Clara Gillispie and Kate Guy, who will give us a clearer understanding of the state of global climate partnerships today, the kinds of partnerships that are possible in our current political context, and the players that are poised to fill the gaps. I'm sure you will have many questions for Clara and Kate. Please drop them in the chat, and I will pose them at the end of the conversation. Now for introductions. Clara Gillispie is a senior fellow for climate and energy at the Council on Foreign Relations and a leading expert on Asian energy security and its implications for U.S. national interests. Her work focuses on U.S.-Asia energy cooperation, including partnerships addressing economic, environmental, and geopolitical challenges, as well as topics such as natural gas exports, zero-carbon energy transitions, and regional engagement in countries like Japan and South Korea. Previously, she served as senior advisor at the National Bureau of Asian Research and was the U.S. delegate to the Energy Research Institute from 2016 to 2025. Her career also includes roles in government, industry, and international relations, and her research spans security, sustainable development, public health, and technology policy in the Indo-Pacific. She holds degrees from Georgetown University, the London School of Economics, and Peking University. Today, we're also welcoming Kate Guy, who is a senior fellow and managing director of the Geopolitics of Climate Change and the Energy Transition at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. She previously served in the Biden-Harris administration, leading the State Department efforts on climate, national security, and foreign policy, and advising senior policy officials, including Special Presidential Envoy John Kerry. Her earlier work includes leadership roles at the Center for Climate and Security and the International Military Council on Climate and Security, as well as positions across government, political campaigns, and policy organizations. Her research and commentary have been widely published in major international outlets. She holds a BA and MA from Columbia University, and she is pursuing a doctorate at the University of Oxford, where she has also lectured. Kate, I think I will have you start off, and then we'll get to Clara with this first question. How would you characterize the current state of global climate partnerships?
Sure.
Actually, Kate, I need to give you a moment to do your intro. Pardon me for prepared remarks. Please do those first.
No, that's a great segue into what I had prepared. So all good. And thank you, Allison. So excited to be here with you and Clara. Thanks to the Pacific Council. I'm out on the East Coast, so sorry I can't be there in a much sunnier, happier place for Climate Week in LA this week. But really excited to be here. To answer your question and to sort of give some opening remarks on just the state of things right now, I'll offer 3 points to our a little dark because I think we're in a dark moment, and that's no surprise to anyone. And the third is hopefully a little bit more forward-looking, optimistic, if you can allow me that right now. So the first sort of picture of where things are today. I've called it a new era of discord in global climate politics. And I think no one who has been following these international summits or global climate diplomacy trends for a long time ever thought that the sort of global climate venue was a happy cooperative space. It's never been that. But there have been sort of higher watermarks than this of sort of multilateralism and consensus. And there always was at least a consensus going back to, the 1990s, 1980s, that global climate change was a challenge that needed to be confronted collectively as the world. And with a shared understanding among countries that there needed to be mitigation to lower emissions, there needed to be efforts to raise global finance for the energy transition, there needed to be investments in adaptation. How to do that and who should do that were always big disagreements in the negotiations. But there was least consensus on those big topics as well as a few others. That sort of consensus is what is breaking down right now. And a lot of that is to do with the position of the United States and the Trump administration. The Trump administration has not just backed away from the Paris Agreement for a second time. Obviously, it did that with a lot of fanfare, but they've actually moved into an aggressive anti-climate position. And they moved the entire sort of US apparatus at the State Department and the White House and sort of diplomats around the world into that much more aggressive. Some experts have called it like a bullying sort of diplomacy position. And that means that they're not just sort of staying away from tables where climate change is discussed, but they're actively instructing diplomats to tank deals that mention the word climate. They are using coercive tools like sanctions to block other countries from agreeing to new measures on climate. They're not just saying we won't be a part of it. They're actually saying we want this deal to die, and we will sort of use the vast tools the US has at its disposal to do that. So examples of this, the US threatened to leave entirely the International Energy Agency earlier this year, right on the brink of the current energy crisis that we're in. So right just before that, they threatened to wholesale leave that international body if the IEA didn't sort of completely eliminate its focus on the energy transition and decarbonization. Earlier, and this is actually still ongoing, the US was really trying to sort of tank new agreement on international shipping emissions mitigation that had been in the works for many years in the International Maritime Organization. The U.S. sort of sent negotiators there to that venue and said, go and threaten individual negotiators from other countries with individual sanctions on them and their families if they do not sort of step away from this deal. So this is quite different than just, exiting the Paris Agreement. This is actually taking a new aggressive approach against any international effort on climate change. And that's quite different. And that's much more hostile than we saw from the Trump administration for the first term. And that's frankly made it very difficult for the rest of the world to carry on in sort of actions it was taking in a direction it was going. Without the Trump administration, it's putting a lot more sort of bounds on them from doing what they might want to do. So the other sort of aspect of this and this new discord era is that with the US taking such a bold position against climate action and frankly such a very, we've seen really pro fossil fuel approach, that actually gives cover to other countries and even other businesses and global entities, local governments from stepping back, for taking that direction too, either from stepping back of commitments they've made, rolling back laws, regulations in the climate space. Many of these commitments were frankly just made in the last few years, in that sort of high point of global action and sort of conversation and commitments on climate. It's sort of repositioning into a rollback of a lot of those realities. And that's for many reasons. That's because of the new sort of emphasis on energy security, the really rapidly growing demand for energy usage, but it's also sort of a reaction to the current moment where it seems like that sort of desire for climate action is taking a back seat to other priorities. So the loud voice of the US in this way that we just talked about gives cover to a lot of other entities who maybe wanted to do that anyways, to take some of that action, and it just makes it a lot more costly for other countries or entities who wanted to be and continue to be very pro climate action from doing that quite loudly right now. That's tough. This is at the same time my second point of where the world is right now. All of that is happening against the backdrop of only growing climate threats. That would all be one thing if things were sort of getting getting better in the world, or if we were looking at even stasis. But that's not the case. The case is that with each passing year, this crisis is getting more intense, more deadly, more costly for all across the world. That is going to be even more pronounced this year as we're looking at an El Nino sort of year for weather patterns. I know you in California are very familiar with that. The latest sort of estimates from scientists is actually for a an El Nino super year, which we last saw back in 2015 and 16, which is just potentially very, very devastating for global agriculture and global extreme weather. And that just really amplifies a lot of the climate signals that we are already seeing in terms of drought, extreme precipitation and storms, and a lot of the severe events that are already so costly and just really bad for livelihoods around the world. This is at the same time that we're just getting a better picture of how intense the climate events are likely to be, even in the next few decades, and in some cases worse than we had anticipated previously. So things like tipping points, the science is getting a lot better on them. The potential loss of critical ecosystem basins globally, the science is getting a lot better on that. And so we're looking at a picture where by mid-century, we're likely to sort of not be meeting the global decarbonization and emissions goals or temperature goals that we had set. And we're also likely to see potentially some of the tipping points in global critical ecosystems breached as early as between 2030 and 2050 in a way that we had not, fully anticipated back in the 90s when some of those temperature goals were being negotiated. So the picture is getting more dire, not less, at the same time that some of that discord is entering in. And you also have new issues coming online where we have not been sort of negotiating around as climate diplomats previously, issues like geoengineering and how to think about that and what to do about some of those climate intervention techniques, migration and border conflicts as sort of the displacement risk only increases on the back of these events, and just intersection with other threats and other systems, which are also not doing so great right now. So think global energy system, global financial system. The intersection of these threats is getting just much more potential for shocks in the coming years. So on the back of those two not so sunny points, I do think that what we're seeing now, and we can talk more about this, is the world is increasingly sort of seeing the sort of acceleration of the energy transition as the safest bet for global economies to take. I do think that is true as the price of clean energy technologies continues to come rapidly down and the innovation in those technologies really continues apace, in large part because of investments by countries like China, but not just China. And as the volatility in the fossil fuel energy system, as demonstrated by the last few weeks, only becomes sort of more present, countries are looking to reclaim some energy security, some energy sovereignty, and that is much more often going to look like clean energy technologies than it's going to look like doubling down into the fossil fuel system. But these are sort of elements that are outside of the sort of global climate negotiations or process, but they do make a very big difference for the trajectory we're on and where we can go. And it's a much bigger sort of energy system conversation. But it is one that I think, increasingly the electrostate kind of future is where a country wants to be much more than a petrostate world. But the time that that takes, how we'll get there, how bumpy it'll be along the way, what level of threats we're going to face because of climate change as we make that transition is all still very up in the air. I think I probably went too long, so I'll stop there, but really excited for a discussion with you in a few. Thanks.
That was an incredibly comprehensive scene setter that touched on so many different aspects of what we'll hopefully dive into a little bit more. So thank you, Kate. Clara, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Allison, and great presentation by Kate as well. I guess if there's one thing that I hope you take away from my remarks, it's that global climate action will succeed or fail depending on what happens in the Indo-Pacific. We're talking about a region that already accounts for over half of global carbon emissions, and that's for multiple reasons, but kind of two key points. One, we're talking about a region that is home to some of the world's largest consumers of energy. So China, India, but also Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, and others. And two, that these consumers are heavily reliant on fossil fuels to meet their needs for energy, and in particular, have an outsized reliance on coal to meet their needs for electricity. And as we kind of stretch out and look towards the next 25 years, it's also this region that is expected to have the most substantial growth in additional demand for electricity. So notable opportunities to think about both how we do this transition to a cleaner energy mix well, but challenges in how we get there that are going to put a premium on the need to deepen and expand our international cooperation. And maybe 3 points that I'd like to hit on up front, and then happy to come back to some or all of them in our discussion. The first one is that, in line with what Kate was highlighting in terms of these shifting narratives and pushback against climate action in the United States, a big question that I often receive is, are we seeing a rise in similar skepticism or pushback within the Indo-Pacific region? And I think encouragingly, there's enough data that we can fairly firmly say no to that point. So the Asian Development Bank, for example, does a fairly comprehensive survey of public sentiment across the region, of all its member countries. The most recent survey coming out in 2024, finding that 91% of respondents said that climate change is a serious concern and challenge. There's often this question too of, even if you see climate change as a serious concern, how notably is that rising to the top of your agenda alongside the other complex challenges that different countries are having to struggle with? Again, here, I think there is some notable and encouraging signs that multiple countries are taking this concern quite seriously. So we have out just this week, I believe, one of the most distinguished surveys that looks across Southeast Asia and ASEAN countries in particular, and asks different elite perspectives, private sectors, academics, to identify what they see as the top threats and concerns, geopolitical challenges across the region. This year, they noted that their top and most challenging concern was climate change again. And this is something that's been coming up in the data year on year for multiple times. And the fact that it's rating so highly in these kind of surveys should not surprise us. For the threats and challenges that both Allison and Kate hit upon, we're really talking about the region that is most vulnerable to those damages. It's already seen the effects of climate change play out, whether you're talking about extreme weather days in India and Pakistan, heat that's already closing businesses and schools on certain days, rising sea levels, concern about erosion there, and just broadly speaking as well, this increase and ongoing rise in toxic air pollution, things that are not only presenting real and immediate challenges to public health and well-being, but are actively shaving off percentage points of countries' GDP growth and growth outlooks. So really hitting at the bottom line of a lot of different countries' national economic agendas. And I say all this up front because I think it really serves to underscore the challenge and the difficulty with grappling with this region's ongoing reliance on coal, as well as the pushback that we've seen from multiple economies, so China and India, but also Japan, on this idea of committing to a date to phase out or otherwise peak and radically reduce their coal-linked emissions. There's a number of different reasons we can get into this in the discussion. Happy to talk more. But one that I like to note on is it's easy to look at these two factors and say maybe the interest in climate change or the interest in a cleaner energy transition isn't overly sincere in this region. I think that's the wrong takeaway. You look at India, for example, it's continued to overperform on several of its targets for solar energy in particular. The statistic I like to highlight is that in some years we've seen it build out solar fleet on scale, or in terms of we've seen it build out a solar energy fleet the size of what the United Kingdom has in total in just 1 year. And yet even still in those years, it's consumed record amounts of coal. And that really, I think, speaks to the sense that the challenge that we face for international cooperation is not just about encouraging countries to adopt the best practices that the United States, Europe, or others has, but really think about areas where we need to have new and more aggressive business models and think more creatively about the way forward. That's point one. Point number two, and I think Kate touched on this some as well too, is this kind of challenge of reconciling our climate ambitions with concerns about energy security. I think sometimes these goals are presented as, objectives that are in opposition or kind of binaries that you cannot prioritize both. And I genuinely think that the current energy crisis that we're seeing unfold across this region speaks to the fact that that is a bit of a misleading perception. When you talk about the vulnerabilities and shocks, you have a number of countries, so Philippines, Indonesia, Korea, and others who have begun to signal their interest, at least, in looking at strategies for stepping up, scaling up not just their use of renewables, but also nuclear energy, other zero carbon technologies, not just from the perspective of not wanting to go back to this worsening environmental outlook, but also because it provides certain things in terms of locally available sourcing, protection from other disruptions in global markets, really aligning with multiple objectives. That being said, and I think the little bit of sober caution here is that when you do see such an extreme shock to the system that we're seeing unfold across multiple countries, so in some cases the sharp reduction in availability of natural gas imports, supplies, other reductions. Yes, you do have countries focus on what can be built tomorrow or, as soon as possible, other opportunities to, again, accelerate some of the steps that were already underway. But first and foremost, the question is always, what is the available capacity today that's being underutilized? And in this region, that answer is far and away, again, still coal. And already we're seeing questions and challenges with multiple countries that I've mentioned and a wider swath as well, reverting and actually increasing their consumption of coal, even as their national security strategies indicate why they don't see that sustainable or in line with their overall long-term objectives. Third and finally is the question of where can the United States fit into these conversations as both partners and spoilers. I'd echo everything that Kate said in terms of this being a very sober and challenging moment. Inconsistency in U.S. federal policy on climate action is not inherently new. It's something that we've seen in multiple points. I would add to what Kate said that my sense of one of the strengths of the United States in this conversation has been the depth and breadth of the partnerships that we built in this region over years and decades, even to address not only some of our goals for climate action, but really thinking about strengthening the resilience of infrastructure, creating opportunities for US firms and others to compete in this space. And the fact that we're talking about, yes, partnerships that are occurring at the government to government level, but also bringing in the private sector, academia, and others. So I would add maybe to the really great points that Kate highlighted that one of my particular concerns about this moment in time is not just the retreat by the US federal government on climate action and even agreeing, yes, with some of the sense of climate bullying, but it's also the dismantling of institutions and bureaucracies for some of our wider energy and environmental conversations, including in a few cases, mechanisms that the first Trump administration really put in place, helped to beef up and buffer as well. I could keep going on here. I know we probably already got some questions going, so I'll stop there and happy to look forward to discussing more.
Thank you, Clara. After hearing both of you speak, I have to wonder what effective climate partnership even looks like today, and what distinguishes it from past multilateral efforts. I wonder, Kate, if you could begin with your thoughts on that, and then we'll go back to Clara.
Sure. And before I do, let me just underscore Clara's last point there about sort of the retreat from multilateralism generally, or sort of like the partnership investments we've made across the world. Really, it really does sort of bear a lot of current and future costs for the United States. And whether or not climate or energy is part of that conversation or not, still keeping strong ties on other sort of mutually beneficial topics like science and innovation and, even regional security, these sorts of things, is a huge source of soft power, and in some cases hard power for the United States. And to step away from that many decadal project is just going to, and I think we've seen, places that's come home to roost as the US then wants to turn around and ask things of those countries in when it needs them, that finds a lot less willing partners there. So to your point, Allison, about what can climate partnership look like now in this much more divided, fragmented, less interested world, I think the benefit that we've seen, even in sort of climate diplomacy circles in the past few years, has been a little bit more emphasis on things like what's called the action agenda in the COP space, but really is just a space for partnership on specific issues between state and non-state actors. And this is in part because of a very big sort of effort by many over years to say that implementation of the Paris Agreement, of the goals that states have set out, is not going to be just for states themselves and is really going to be a project that everybody in society needs to be part of. I think I saw him here. Yeah, Jacob Scher is on the line. Jacob Scher was one of the leading voices talking about the need for this collective non-state actor approach to climate partnership for many, many years. And we've seen the rest of the world kind of finally bring that approach a little bit more online through something that's called the action agenda and the COP process, but really is just a space for entities that have overlapping interests to put forward actions they want to take together on that. And that can also get at some spaces where you don't have a COP process focused on, or or maybe like some countries are really against it and they want to gum it up. But other countries can move forward and can say, we're going to work on this together. So in the past few years, we've seen efforts like that on global methane emissions. And that's something the US led, but really was able to bring together a coalition of countries to say, we really want to focus on methane, this greenhouse gas that causes a lot of near-term warming and could have a huge implication for the trajectory we're on if we're able to just shave some of those methane emissions off. Or things like climate and health, right? One of these spaces where we're seeing a lot more health threats and health issues because of a changing climate. But there isn't really a good space to work on that together. Well, countries created the space along with non-state actors and philanthropy and other health experts to say we want to sort of work on these topics together. There's a variety of topics. I'm happy to talk about them all, but I think these sort of coalition-based partnerships have more legs to them because they're not sort of built on the negotiation process as it traditionally is. They're built much more on people who sort of, or entities that have those interests wanting to take them forward. And I think we've seen some good results come out of that.
Those are great, concrete, and even hopeful examples. Thank you. Clara, could you tackle that same question for us? What does a climate partnership even look like these days?
Yeah. A couple thoughts there. Sometimes what a climate partnership might look like these days is not necessarily about climate. It can speak to some of our broader energy security goals. And two, sometimes it's going to look deeply unsexy, I have to say, of like in terms of the work that needs to be done. So, if we were having this conversation, even let's say 15 years ago, the real challenge for thinking about how we accelerate and scale up renewable energy or other cleaner technologies would be about some of the limits in the technologies themselves. Deeper concerns then about the availability and robustness of battery storage, questions about actual capacity potential, a number of other factors I could go on, but really having seen breakthroughs there and potential breakthroughs and at least the potential economic competitiveness of a lot of these sources, again, relative to traditional fuels, there's still that question of, okay, well, what's actually holding them back now? Like, what do we need to do to take that next step? And again, sometimes that work is deeply unsexy. It's in the weeds kind of regulatory systems. It's very minute tweaks to existing legislation. The example I'll give and kind of zero in on Southeast Asia in particular, you had Cambodia, for example, which has fairly robust and substantial potential for solar energy generation. It's ideally situated where it could also be a potential exporter of electricity to other major consumers who are very nearby adjacent as well. And one of the challenges that Cambodia had for tapping into that potential was less about the technology itself and more about some really in the weeds questions of how you navigate the peak demand versus peak supply periods of the grid, as well as the fact that in the face of that uncertainty of how you do that, there were some restrictions on how you could actually scale up rooftop solar, but not sell back excess electricity to the grid. So we weren't realizing some of the economics of scale, other benefits. That was something that needed both a specific change in legislation and regulatory practices, but also needed things like training of utility operators, other access to better modeling data, work to better predict weather patterns, not for the climate basis, but to better understand both when you could potentially be seeing surge in availability of particular supplies, opportunities to balance or address shortfalls with hydropower. Again, a lot of in the weed works. And I'm specifically focusing on why these matter to renewable energy, but a lot of these efforts to develop reskilling, think about the flexibility of the grid, are things that are going to matter to a wide range of different energy sources as well. And I think you do have the opportunity to bring in shared and unlikely partners. The last one I'll say, and I keep having some pause on what my endorsement here is, but I think it's worth noting in the particular moment we're in right now, is that as countries struggle with their ongoing consumption of coal and the rise in emissions from that, there's of course a role for thinking about how you accelerate switching to cleaner fuels, but also an ongoing need to acknowledge how you address with this ongoing consumption, whether that's the deployment of cleaner and more efficient tools, other ways that you might boost efficiency to lower overall demand. I think there's a lot of open questions about what addressing that beyond switching looks like to do well.
Makes sense. Let me have you tackle this one, and then we'll hear from Kate. I'm wondering what role regional alliances, for example, Indo-Pacific partnerships, can have and should have in advancing climate goals.
So there are a number of forums that immediately come to my mind that have played a really important and powerful role in this space. So of course, you have, for example, the IEA, which acts as kind of an international umbrella organization, bringing together multiple partners from this region, but it doesn't really fully cover every economy in this region. Some are association members, so they have ways that they are participating in trainings and other coordination, access to knowledge, but not necessarily held by the same obligations or meeting as of yet, some of the requirements of IEA members. So beyond the IEA and thinking about these institutions, you have, for example, the East Asia Summit, which brings together not just China, Japan, Korea, but also India and Southeast Asia at large. You have APEC as well, focusing on the Asia Pacific region, bringing in a little bit more of the Americas. And each of these forums are places where the US has been a powerful and important partner as well, not just in terms of our advocacy on agendas and best practices, but also, again, getting into some of the weeds on technical standards, how you draft an effective electricity, like power agreements, how you think about developing standards for cross-border sharing. These are things where, as the US retreats, it's not going to be that those conversations stop happening. It's just that the US will have less influence at that table on what actually comes out of those conversations.
Kate, any thoughts?
No, that was an excellent answer. I will just add to that maybe and also sort of address the question in the chat about like other countries taking leadership other than the United States, which is the place we're in, and we've been here before. Other countries would say we've been here quite frequently before, where the U.S. changes its mind and position and retreats. I think one thing I'll say on that though is that the rest of the world is not immune from the politics that are sort of happening in the United States right now, right? And some of this is, specific to the Trump administration and his beliefs, but a lot of this is also, a growing backlash to rising energy prices and, growing energy demand and competition from data center growth. There's so many issues here that in different contexts can create a backlash against climate policy and regulation and emissions commitments and net zero commitments. And in other contexts can actually help further the energy transition or maybe do both at the same time. So sort of my answer to how can other countries take a leadership role and to your question, Allison, about like how they can do that jointly is to make this about energy security and energy sovereignty and energy affordability and responding to the current energy crisis where the United States is a little bit buffered, but not entirely buffered from what a lot of other countries, especially countries in Southeast Asia, are seeing as a massive shock to energy availability. And a big answer to a lot of those concerns is a faster and a more aggressive transition to clean energy technologies for security reasons and sovereignty reasons and demand reasons. So I think the way that countries are able to lean into that, maybe not with a huge climate capital C message behind it, but responding to the politics as they are domestically and globally, and taking on that challenge, like can put them in a leadership position at a time when you have leadership from the United States backing down. And I'll just say some countries are trying to do this, and I think we've seen China do this. I think we've seen the European Union also do it. but they're also all in sort of difficult positions with their own emissions trajectories as well.
Well, you both have mentioned China and India. Those countries have come up a number of times. Uh, how are they reshaping climate leadership, and really, what does that mean for U.S. influence?
I'll stick on the China bit. As I mentioned it. So I think China is difficult because obviously they're the world's largest emitter, and have been very hesitant to stray from the current commitments it has made to be more ambitious or, promise peaking faster or anything like that. Even if they might, very likely, who knows how the current sort of crisis will impact this. Excuse me. But they've been very hesitant to say, like, we're going to step forward as a big climate leader in our own emissions. However, it's very clear to me that they have a diplomatic objective to sort of seize the mantle of climate leadership in the multilateral context right now. And they have been trying to, and saying, not only are we powering the energy transition for the rest of the world by our massive investments in these technologies over many decades now, but we also, are ones who have stuck around, right? We're here, we're stable, we're not playing the same sort of discord, volatile role as the United States, and really drawing that contrast. And they're sort of walking in the space that the US has exited, including in bilateral and multilateral deals. The effort between China and Canada, the effort between China and the European Union right now to come in and say, let's invest jointly in electric vehicles, let's invest in some of that clean energy supply chain. I think particularly when it comes to vehicles, these aren't likely not deals some of these countries would have looked at making with Chinese automakers were it not from the US sort of really turning tack and running away from that space. I think both the Europeans and the Canadians have a lot of domestic industry with a lot of political power in the vehicle and automotive space, that sort of doing deals with China there could come with political risk to them. But with the US sort of backing away from that space, it makes it a lot more important for them to turn to other countries like China right now. But really curious for what Clara has to say here too.
Me too.
Yeah, no, I was gonna largely agree with everything that you said on China, and maybe just underline the point that you had of, one of the reasons we talk about China as articulating its role and its prominence in climate leadership is not inherently because Chinese officials at the highest level are deeply passionate about climate change or even worried about environmental shock. It is also that Chinese firms across the board have now developed pretty robust manufacturing capacities, economic competitiveness in multiple points, partnerships with various regions that also serve Beijing's economic agenda, much less its geopolitical aims to deepen cooperation with particular partners, and in some cases, use that leverage to shape how individual countries then pursue their own domestic policy agendas. We've seen this, for example, play out in China-Korea relations, but also China's engagements in multiple parts of South and Southeast Asia as well. Maybe to add a little bit about India and in terms of how it sees its leadership in this space. So historically, India has been fairly resistant to setting caps or kind of other curbs or commitments to peak its emissions. And in a number of ways, that's not overly surprising, just given the trajectory of its energy demand growth. So I think the current estimates are that, despite already being one of the world's largest electricity markets, between now and 2040, its demand for electricity is again going to somewhere between triple or quadruple. So India is moving pretty aggressively in terms of both its ramp up of renewables and its efforts to promote energy efficiency. It's also started in the last year to get a little bit more bullish on some additional technologies and tools. So wading in the electric vehicles market a little bit more than it historically has, doing more on nuclear space, for example, reforming an open unit sector to international investment. But really, when I think about what distinguishes India in terms of its international climate leadership, that is its effort to acknowledge and bring in that we're still looking for a lot of best practices. And in some cases, we don't necessarily have that natural forum or natural example that's well positioned to actually accelerate reductions further. So you have, for example, India taking on a pretty significant role in the establishment of the International Solar Alliance, its other multilateral partnerships, so the Quad arrangement with the United States, Australia, and Japan as well, bringing climate action, cleaner technologies into these conversations as well, and not always in the space of inherently, again, committing to a curb on emissions reductions or to being out front and more aggressive in that, but really in trying to think about how you accelerate the focus on cleaner energy technologies.
Well, we have some really great questions in the chat, and I want to get to those soon. So I think I'm just going to ask you one more question. We're grappling with how to create partnerships, international partnerships in this context, what they look like, but maybe I will go one step further with this last question, and how in this context do we ensure that developing countries benefit equitably from climate investments? Maybe Kate?
Sure, yeah. I mean, one thing that I find really interesting just from like an international relations perspective is as you have this greater and more prominent competition between the US and China, or even if you could say great powers generally, especially between US and China, that can actually be a really fertile space for developing countries that otherwise might not have a lot of, relative power to those great powers. But can put themselves in a position of sort of playing those two off each other or seeking deals with both in various ways. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of increasingly, especially when it comes to energy, is like you'll have developing countries in multiple regions of the world sort of look to what can we get out of cooperation with China and what can we get to with cooperation out of the United States. And both come with their own risks, their own, various types of sustainability, literally environmental sustainability, but also timeline sustainability. How long are those partnerships really going to stick around for in the US context? But it allows for a space of potentially reaping more from those deals in terms of investment, in terms of development assistance, and many different spaces. I also think that, as the Trump administration moves to what it says is much more of a deal-making sort of posture, so diplomacy not based on some sort of, value-based structure, but really based on, I think, what they would say is mutual interest and what can benefit the United States, what can benefit the other country. That also sort of opens up a space for some countries that otherwise might have been, having to deal with a lot of other U.S. priorities that they had for those relationships. So I'm thinking of places where the U.S. might have been bringing democratic concerns or how they treated political opposition in their country, or some of these other things that we spent a lot of time as the U.S. Really carrying the water for that agenda globally, and including in our bilateral diplomacy, with a lot of those values and those issues and those topics off the table. Also treatment of women and treatment of vulnerable populations, with those sort of seemingly pushed out of the U.S. priorities, that can open up some space for developing countries to have somewhat more productive deals on the table that we can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for those countries or for the world. But it certainly is something that I think we've seen developing countries rise to. The other place we've sort of seen a lot of what I've just been talking about in terms of pairing the two great powers off each other and moving in is in the space of critical mineral diplomacy. So this is a topic that the U.S. has long been trying to advance. Under the Biden administration, this looked like a sort of friend-shoring sort of coalition of like-minded partner countries under the Mineral Security Partnership, trying to pursue building a supply chain to rival the Chinese sort of dominance in critical minerals. Now, under the Trump administration, there's been a lot of activity here, but it's also allowed for a lot of mineral-rich countries to put a lot more demands and potential areas they want investment in exchange for some access to those minerals forward. And in some cases, that has looked like energy deals with the Trump administration.
Interesting. Clara.
Yeah, I was struck by your comment in particular on thinking about how we make this an equitable energy transition where developing economies could benefit. And this immediately made me think of some of the conversations we've had around the just energy transition partnerships, which, for those in the audience who might not be familiar, this idea of a mechanism where if really the challenge here is the role of coal and coal-linked emissions in driving climate action concerns or climate change concerns, and that switching from coal is often complex, costly, and involves multi-stakeholder coordination and strong political will, that these just energy transition partnerships could be both a mechanism for coordinating that and also as a way of injecting new funding and support into efforts to transition to a cleaner mix in return for commitments to early phase outs, early closures, retirements of coal-fired power plants. We've seen a couple of countries in the Indo-Pacific sign on to these partnerships. So Indonesia is the one that's on my mind, but notably India did not. Despite its agreed and shared concern about the future of coal and its energy mix and the challenge of phasing out coal without some pretty substantial attention to questions about the costs and challenges that would hit upon some of its most vulnerable citizens. A lot of India's concerns hit upon the idea of, are these mechanisms really more focused on loans than grants? So rather than this being something that addresses the way that we're thinking about equity and, environmental justice, it's signing us up for, new loans and obligations that we would ultimately still have to find a way to pay back, other challenges. And I mean, that remains the fundamental challenge, figuring out how to actually stimulate that investment, think about covering that cost is an area where I feel like we, the United States, but really we collectively globally have not fully cracked the code on. There's a lot of attention to this idea of there are efforts and steps that could be taken to help these developing economies be able to better absorb capital from overseas, make more projects bankable, ways that they could address political risk. Again, think about developing some of the local capacity or other factors that, again, would make them more attractive to private sector partners. I think there was a question in the earlier in this conversation about how, these are all things where obviously the US federal government and public policy can play a really positive and strong role. But US states have also been quite active in this space, both at the leadership of their own local governments, but you also have in California, for example, universities have been really positive partners in the spaces, developing some of the direct people-to-people exchanges, other ways that they focused on helping to commercialize various technologies, advanced breakthroughs that would make them more efficient, more viable. I do feel there's a lot more work that could be done in this space. We just don't have a sense of how to get fully all the way to where we need to be yet.
Yeah, Clara, let's get to that question in the chat right now. It's from S. Jacob Scher, and he writes, California is the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world. What role could California play in the international arena to keep moving forward on climate? Kate, do you want to start off in response to that?
Sure. I mean, I think there are many ways. One way is in messaging and in showing up. And I think this is really important. It's a role that California has played during both Trump administrations and previous administrations as well. For example, Gavin Newsom was, I think, the highest ranking American to show up at COP last year and say, we're still here, give the speeches, but also pledge that sort of the Trump administration approach on climate is not the only approach on climate in the United States, and that big states like California, but also entities across the United States are taking different approaches. And I think that is really important because for countries that are recalibrating their approach to the US, having them reminded that for better or for worse, it is a like swing back and forth sort of reality here, that if they move too far away from and backtrack too much from their climate commitments, that could put them sort of at odds with the future U.S. administration if Democrats come to power, is important, and it sort of provides that messaging balance that many would say that the world needs right now. So that's one way. Beyond just sort of the politics of it, I think Clara has already pointed to a lot of ways that California, its universities, its businesses are able to lead investment and innovation and everything that goes into the transition in its own right, and have long been sort of the leading institutions on the development of these technologies and their implementation. I'll add to that one area we haven't really talked about a lot, but is I think critically important, and that's not just the energy mitigation side, but it's also the resilience side of the climate equation. And I think as I talk to folks in these countries and around the world, more and more the issues of resilience and adaptation are coming up as top climate priorities because of the rising threats and the rising shocks, and the need to really safeguard as much of our property and our livelihoods as possible. So this is an area, of course, that California knows very personally, from wildfire risk to drought risk to extreme precipitation events. It is an area of the country that has had to weather a lot of storms and figure out a lot of adaptation and resilience investments. And I will say, still needs to. There's a lot more work that needs to be done on this. And so the more that California can start, really figuring out these problems, and the deeper problems too of insurance and what happens there, to the future of the real estate and insurance markets, to things like next generation desalination and water technologies. These are things that can really help Californians now and into the future, but can also be a basis for diplomacy and partnership with other countries and localities around the world. And I think a lot of other parts of the world are hungry for these technologies, are demanding this know-how, and California is smart, and I know that it is, and I know a lot of researchers are doing this. It will think locally and globally with a lot of these investments at the same time.
You mentioned the word resilience, and I know we're getting close to time on this program today, but I'd like to just briefly hear from you. Resilience has really become a word that many in the American policy space seem to be leaning on right now. Are you seeing that internationally? Are others referring to resilience as much as we are here in the US when we try to push some of these measures through to protect people from, for example, as you said, Kate, wildfires, flooding?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of this is political, right? Because at least in this country, if climate is increasingly becoming this like very political word to bring with it a lot of political baggage, something like resilience, at least in some places, is a much more sort of not as politically coded term. Though I will say in some places, even that is becoming a political term. But it's something that, what local mayor doesn't want resilience from its community from extreme events, regardless of the climate question, regardless of sort of the mitigation questions, like who doesn't want to invest in making its community safer and safeguarding its infrastructure locally. So yes, across the world, I think resilience for some countries has long been their priority. And if you talk to countries in Southeast Asia, small island states, our African partners, they have been raising adaptation and resilience to the top of their agenda for a very long time. And I think hopefully they finally see the rest of the world waking up to that. And to that need and sort of a rebalancing of the prioritization of mitigation and adaptation, and investment in things like early warning systems for those communities. In some cases, I will also say some of the, typically most vulnerable, least developed states have been the ones innovating a lot of resilience measures that they are now teaching the rest of the world about. I think about Bangladesh and their tsunami warning system and their sort of extreme storm response innovations that they have had sort of been developing for many years. The rest of the world is now saying, oh, we should look at that and we should think about implementing some of those same policies of direct monetary transfer to help people get out of the way of the storm or the flooding, things like that in their own countries. And so it's a two-way street. Partnership is not just about one side helping the other, but actually mutual learning is critically important. And I think particularly when it comes to resilience, there's just so much room for good and interesting ideas and diplomacy here that we have not really pursued yet. That makes me really excited as this rises up the priority list for the United States and for other countries.
Well, we are just about at time. We have 1 minute left. So I want to take a moment to thank the Pacific Council for organizing this event. Thank you to Kate Guy and Clara Gillispie. You certainly surfaced some partnerships and even some bright spots in the conversation about international climate partnerships. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did too. I want to thank you both, and also, I hope to see you around and continue this conversation, because if there's one thing I learned today, it's that there's so much more to discuss. So thank you very much. Happy Climate Week to those of you who are in LA, and to everybody else. See you around.